Hey, welcome back to Communication Research Methods class. This is Bram Duffee, and today we're talking about ethnography. And through chapter 8, you'll get a good rundown, but I want to talk about it myself with you. Ethnography is a research method used to describe and interpret cultural practices from the perspective of those who live within that culture. It allows us to understand behaviors and customs through the eyes of a cultural insider. So, by immersing ourselves in a community, we can draw meaningful conclusions for observed behaviors. This stuff provides a rich, detailed portrayal of everyday life. So, what is this ethnography? Well, imagine you're a detective who loves to learn about different people and places. Ethnography is like being a special kind of detective who studies how different groups of people live. And so, what does an ethnographer do? Well, an ethnographer is someone who watches, listens, and learns about people to understand their way of life. They might travel to a faraway country to see how people there celebrate holidays, or visit an unfamiliar work environment. They might spend time with a new family to know their daily routines and traditions. But why is all this important? That ethnography helps us understand and respect the many different ways people live around the world. It's like getting a peek into someone else's world and learning that even though we might do things differently, we can still find common ground. And so let me share with you some examples about what an ethnographer might study. There are different environments out there. So an ethnographer could visit a new work environment and learn about how people feel about their interactions with customers. Or an ethnographer could visit an Amazon rainforest to live with a tribe and learn about their special ways of hunting and gathering food. But cultural knowledge can be thought of as shared understanding within the community. And it comes in different forms. It's like explicit and implicit. And if we're trying to understand a community, we have to see things through both lenses to be able to get a good perspective. So this explicit knowledge is a clear and easy way to share. It's like rules or guidelines that are written down. On the other hand, implicit knowledge is more about unspoken norms and unspoken things that, values maybe that people follow without needing to write them down. And ethnographers who study cultures try to understand both kinds of knowledge. And they use this method called thick description. That's how we do that. And this means that they write down detailed stories that explain not just what people do, but also the reasons and the meanings behind their actions. So, for example, they might describe people meeting in a marketplace, but they would also explain why that place is important, maybe for socializing or for building community ties. And that kind of approach helps capture the full picture about how and why these cultural practices occur. When I study different things, I have to recognize that, as we've talked about a lot in class, the question that you have is going to determine what research method you choose. And we've just come off a section of talking and working with surveys. And you'll notice that some research questions are suited for a survey. They make sense. But in this case, I want to talk about some research questions that make sense for an ethnography kind of study. And the reason that I learned about ethnography to begin with really is that because I work in the medical field. And when you work in the medical field, it's not that easy to get patient consent and find out inundate someone at a time when they're at risk, or especially in my field, because in emergency medicine, you can imagine that I don't want to it's not proper to take the worst moment in this person's life and say, hey, would you mind answering a few questions? Can you do a research study? Can you sign here? And that person's not able to properly consent or think through what's even, happening with that. And it's not fair. And so if I'm going to try to learn about in a particular environment, then another way to do that would be, if I can't really study the patients directly, I can study the people that work there directly. I could learn about what it's like for them. And one of the things that I always say when it comes to restaurants and places like emergency rooms, because I go to lots of different ones, is that I like to look and see if I can tell if the people like their jobs. And sometimes that's a question that you can ask yourself going into a new environment. Do these people seem to like their job? And that in itself is an ethnographic kind of study that, that I am doing myself, walking into an environment like that. But let's talk about how some research questions might take shape. And I wrote down some questions that we can talk about. One, this is just a potential research question. Imagine that you're trying to figure this out. How do daily rituals and routines of a particular cultural group reflect their cultural values and beliefs? So a particular cultural group, that could be anything from a different religion from the researcher, a different environment that researchers never been in before. Like, for example, one of the areas that I research are stressful environments where people are involved in stressful communication during medical emergencies. And so that's why I not only immerse myself in that environment for one perspective, but also study and interview and work with the other responders that are in those environments. So in this case, how do daily rituals and routines of a particular cultural group, so the cultural group is fill in the blank, right? Because the question says, how does that cultural group use rituals and routines to reflect their values and beliefs? So what we have here is just too many variables within a question. And not only that, these are deep variables, right? So if we think about how could we look at this question from the perspective of a researcher wanting to do a survey versus a researcher wanting to do an ethnographic kind of study, it's really difficult to make these variables match up in a way so that we can get some deep understanding. Let me read the question again. This might be the potential research question. How do the daily rituals and routines of a particular cultural group reflect their values and beliefs? So let's have some fun time, and let me work with you to imagine a particular cultural group, right? So let's fill in the blank so you can think about how this question would work in real-time practice, okay? Let's use Smurfs, okay? Because we know what those are, right? Those are the little cartoon characters, right? So let's pretend like we're looking at them. How do the daily rituals and routines of a Smurf group village reflect their values and beliefs? See how that all of a sudden just made more sense? We substituted particular cultural group with like something that we knew about. We could have also said something like, I was going to say like Power Rangers, or we could say Muppets, or we could say any kind of thing that we're not familiar with, just to be fun. Dracula, like the werewolves. What question, fill in the blank, leads to more exploration in your mind, right? How do the daily rituals and routines of a particular cultural group, so how do these daily rituals and routines, so think about what do Smurfs do daily and ritualistically, okay? And so once we can document that, how do we match that up with what we know about their values and beliefs, right? So this is how we look at the question in a deeper level. Let me read another question I wrote down that's a potential research question as an example. These are just examples of potential research questions for ethnographers. What are the social dynamics and power structures within a specific community, and how do they shape individual and group behaviors? Okay, so let me go back to Dracula and let's use vampires, okay? So in that question, instead of saying in a specific community, let's use the vampire community and think through the question, right? Because now we're able to put this in just a different kind of perspective. What are the social dynamics and power structures within a vampire community, and how do they shape individual and group behaviors? See, now you can imagine power structures and dynamics within that group and how that would take place. So we're not going to be writing about fake things in this class, and we're not going to be doing research about Smurfs or any other kind of Muppets or anything like that. But I'm using these so that we can think about these questions and what they would be like if we applied them to a particular cultural group. What are the processes by which cultural knowledge, skills, and traditions are transmitted across generations within a particular cultural group? So we're saying particular cultural group. Let's fill in the blank with what you might look at that from that perspective. What are the processes which cultural knowledge, skills, and traditions are transmitted? Well, first of all, think about your own culture. What are the processes with your own culture? How are those things transmitted across generations? Maybe furniture is handed down. Maybe jewelry is handed down. I know that a lot of families now are doing things on video to videotape their loved ones talking and telling stories. There's a popular some kind of commercial thing to purchase where you can have your loved one write a book about themselves so that you can take their ask them to write prompts and where they respond to emails from this book program. So there are all kinds of different things that we might think about. How are cultural knowledge and traditions transmitted? Also through religion. So these kinds of deep questions are not questions that we can figure out by just throwing out a survey or just one interview, right? It's going to take a mixture of understanding. And so we often, when we do ethnographic research, we will often look at our research question. And then after taking that research question, usually the first field study will be something like immersing ourselves in that culture so that we can understand all these different dynamics. And then to follow that up, to sort of check ourselves and to look at it from different perspectives, that would then set us up to be able to establish a focus group about a particular topic with that group, or to do interviews, or to maybe do a survey. So you sort of start out a lot of times with that full immersion, because ethnographic research aims to provide in-depth contextual understanding of human behavior. And it's not just that, it's also the reasons that govern the behavior. A lot of times it focuses on lived experiences and the perspectives of the cultural groups or communities. One specialized approach within ethnography is called ethnography of speaking. It's called EOS. So ethnography of speaking is a research method that focuses on how different cultures communicate and provides a way to look at their social interactions. A key concept in ethnography of speaking is that the speech community, a group that shares common communication practices, right? And so to analyze these practices, researchers often use this word framework where they take an acronym, where like one letter of a word means this and another letter means that. Well, the word speaking, S-P-E-A-K-I-N-G, is broken down into an acronym that helps remember the different things to evaluate during this time as an ethnographer, right? So each thing stands for something. So it's, I have notes to help me remember, but it's setting and scene, participants, ends, act sequence, key, instrumentalities, norms, and genre, right? So these are big academic words. And so each element helps dissect the context and the structure of communication. So for example, in analyzing a public speech, you would consider the physical location. The physical location is setting, right? The emotions involved, that's the scene, the audience and speaker, those are the participants, also the goals of the speech, that's the ends, the sequence of events, the tone. So these different aspects help break up and understand, figure out what things might need to be evaluated. Also, the genre, right? So like whether it's a formal address or a casual talk, if the norms of the event are followed, right? Like the unwritten norms. So these kinds of things help us take our ethnographic experience and apply some structure to it of like what we want to look at and think about and evaluate. So moving on from that, there's a different kind of approach to ethnography called ethnography of communication, right? And what we want to speak to is the fact that we were referring to ethnography of speaking, right? EOS. When we talk about ethnography of speaking, that's the concept that looks at the speech community and has the framework that breaks it down through the acronym, okay? And that word was using the word speaking. But differently, there's a different type of approach called ethnography of communication. So ethnography of communication is this approach to ethnography that expands the study of cultures beyond just one community. So imagine that you're at like a large, diverse festival with people from all over the world, and this kind of environment is an environment where you might share common characteristics. And so it's like walking through that festival, observing how different groups interact and communicate. Ethnography of communication looks at both what makes each culture unique and what they might share in common, like how greetings or storytelling is done. So by comparing these interactions across multiple communities, it helps find universal patterns. So things that cultures may do that's really similar. And it highlights the unique cultural expressions, like specific rituals or way of expressing emotions. And I think about going as a Boy Scout when I was a kid, going to a national jamboree, because we have troops from all over the world that would come there, and then we were all there for the same reason, the same goals. But you know, there were very interesting intricacies, differences in the culture, language, and just cool stuff like the uniform being different. So thinking about ethnography of communication is kind of like that. It's looking at groups and trying to pull individual patterns. Now, I want to take ethnography as a topic and shift gears a little bit, because I want to bring your memory to a similar topic. You know, you may remember that when we talk about biography, a biography is a book that's written about the person by someone else. The autobiography would be a book that the person wrote about themselves. So we think about the way those words are used now. I want to introduce you to a type of ethnography research called autoethnography. Autoethnography takes a more personal route. Notice that we're taking the word ethnography and adding auto to it, right? So A-U-T-O. So we're talking about the type of ethnography, autoethnography. So imagine that you're writing a diary about your experiences. So when we do something like that, it's a method that allows you to use your personal insights to dive deeper into a cultural phenomenon. It's like combining a personal diary with a research paper. And it's in that research, you analyze your own experiences in that way to provide a richer, more nuanced understanding of the cultural practices. By blending introspection with academic analysis, autoethnography offers a deeply contextualized view that makes the cultural study not just about others, but about how we relate and connect with these narratives personally. Ethnographic research can take different kinds of claims and expand to help uncover and understand topics. And I want to review some of those claims that are covered in chapter 8 because there's a breakdown here that helps us think about some of these cross sections. So a particular claim is what we're viewing, what we're taking into account, the lens of perspective, okay? So one kind of claim is called a descriptive claim. These tell us about the practices and behaviors of a group. So think of it like a detailed observation of what people in a community do every day. That would be like a descriptive claim. And it's a little bit different than an interpretive claim. An interpretive claim goes a step further because it explains why people do the things a certain way and how their communication and culture are connected. It's like figuring out the meaning behind their actions. Also, we have evaluative claims, and these assess the value or the impact of certain practices. So they might point out which traditions are beneficial or which need attention. The other kind of claim is a reformist claim. And a reformist claim is something that suggests that changes or improvements should be uncovered based on what that study finds. So it can propose ways to adapt or preserve cultural practices in response to modern challenges. So let's think about these different claims. I have a story that helps kind of pull these together. Imagine a study of a small village. If you were going to look at this from a particular perspective, you would get a different kind of outcome, right? So a descriptive claim of a small village might detail how villagers gather every evening to share stories. An interpretive claim could explain how this tradition strengthens their community bonds. The evaluative claim might highlight the importance of this practice in maintaining social ties. And then a reformist claim could suggest ways to keep this tradition alive despite changes in the digital age. So this approach helps researchers not only observe, but also understand and suggest ways to support their cultural practices. Ethnographic data is typically collected through participant observation. So when you say, how are you doing your research? Well, I'm using blank as a tool. So the tool here is participant observation. And that would be like if I'm using a focus group, or if I'm doing a survey, or if I'm, this is a participant observation. So it involves examining the communication in its natural setting. The researcher might take an active or a passive role depending on the needs of the study and the research question that you're trying to propose. Additional methods that you might use include interviews, which range from collecting oral histories to gathering personal narratives and maybe even doing topic interviews. These kinds of things might come secondary, right? So you would start out maybe doing an immersive kind of data gathering. And then when figuring out different aspects to that environment, it would lead to questions that would require clarification, so that you would need to understand history of things. You would need to understand processes. You would need to understand, what's happening. So that means that maybe there's a next phase where you might do an actual survey, or you might do a focus group, or you might do interviews. But ethnographic research a lot of times starts out by an immersion into that environment to kind of figure out what's going on. And the field work, and that's what it's called, during the time that we're doing that kind of field work, we just have to be open to change and prepared for unexpected developments. I think about someone who's doing field work as someone maybe sitting in a mall watching people, but this is a lot different because we're immersing ourselves in a different environment, a lot of times uncomfortable place that we would never have been before, and interacting with folks that we're not used to interacting with in a different kind of situation, right? So a whole different thing. When we do field work, detailed note-taking is really important, and so is important is identifying the point at which further data collection on a topic doesn't really lend itself to any new insights. So when we've just got so much data that we don't need anymore because it all kind of shows the same, or we've got a lot of repeat stuff, we call that data saturation. And that might be a time where it's, time to evaluate where you're at and evaluate, what's happening with how you're conducting your field research, because a lot of times we can get a huge amount of material doing qualitative research, and we have to remember to sort of go back and look at our original research question all the time so that we can make sure that we are limiting ourselves to the information that we need. If we get all this extra stuff, it can be really distracting. And at the end of the day, we are trying to figure out the answer to a particular question, right? So to do that, we want to stay on target. And I'm talking about how, note-taking is essential. And during field work, we want to make sure that we are organized enough so that we can work to get to a point of and understand when we're at data saturation. The data analysis part, like after you have the information, when we do data analysis in ethnography, the process can really vary, but researchers typically start by identifying categories and themes, letting patterns emerge from the data through an inductive process. And this kind of approach ensures that the analysis is grounded in sort of the cultural context. So to figure this out or make this happen, you might write down themes from each experience, right? And by being able to take your notes and find patterns or themes or common occurrences, that's the kind of thing that will help you from the correct perspective, that will allow you to examine the cultural aspects, because we aren't just looking at things from the point of A to B. We have to look at A and surround A with the whole alphabet, with understanding our perspective as the researcher, the cultural environment, the interactions and why they make sense. So all of these aspects are helped by going through the checklist. And the kind of checklist that I think about are, I make a checklist of the kinds of claims that I have, and I also make a review of the speaking framework, right? When we look at something like the ethnography of speaking, to be able to make sure that we have evaluated the tone, we've looked at the language style, we've thought about the emotions involved. See, these aren't applicable for every situation, but at least if we set this up as a tool, we're able to remember what is important in the analysis. And then when we get to the end, we have done this analysis in a way so that we can take our notes and think through themes. So with all this, I look forward to seeing your own research study. And so reach out to me if you have questions, and I'll see you in class in the next video.